Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to have you here with us this evening for an interesting conversation on working across cultures. This is the second conversation in our Going Global series. My name is Chelsea Watts. I'm the Director of Global Programs and Partnerships at the Feliciano School of Business. And I will just be introducing our panelists and as well as our moderator, and we'll get going. We'll have a conversation for about 45 minutes or so, and we'll have plenty of time for questions. You should see a chat feature or a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the conversation. We can stop at the end of each panelist if you have specific individual questions. Otherwise, we'll reserve time at the end as well. So not to delay, I'll introduce our fantastic panelists. We have Jeffrey Chellis, who is the president of Expedia Consulting, and Sam McDermott, who is the assistant vice president of global luxury sales with Shangri-La Hotels, and Diana Todaro, who is an international legal consultant and international business professional. I also want to introduce our moderator, Dr. Juju. She is an assistant professor with the Feliciano School of Business and will be leading the conversation today. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Juju.
Okay, thank you, Chelsea, for putting this panel together. We have really wonderful panelists. I think our students can learn a lot. I think this topic of working cross-culturally is super important, not just because I'm biased, because my research focus on cross-cultural management, international expansion. Also, my consulting work is similar. But with COVID-19 and the way that lots of companies around the world are changing the way they hire and work with each other, the world is becoming a smaller place, right? So there's much more opportunities now, even compared to before, to work with people from all around the world in different cultures. So without further ado, I'm going to, so the format of today's panel will be, I will focus on each panelist at a time. So they will each have 10 to 15 minutes to talk about some interesting topics. So I'll start with Jeff, right? So our first panelist is Jeff. So Jeff, being the founder and CEO of your own consulting firm is very exciting. So you have a very impressive background. So when you started your career, did you know that you were going to work on a global basis? Did you do anything to prepare for that? And how has your career grown over the years?
Well, to be honest with you, I was just happy to get off of Long Island at the time. And my hopes were to see the world, but it started short of that, but in an exciting way. I worked for a sales promotion company, and we wound up supporting a number of promotional activities, but the one that I got associated with was rodeos. So I spent 1 week in acting out various types of promotional events, sampling, giving away different types of products, samples, and hats and shirts and everything else. And every week you had to move to another city. So I was constantly asked to essentially perform a living commercial at rodeos before people went in and often on their way out. But every week was a different set of circumstances. There were opportunities and there were challenges. But what I found was there was some real insights coming from that the same approach doesn't work in all places. And often the difference is really engaging with the local people there and getting both their input and their support, and certain times just having them come in and save the day for me where I needed it. And that really gave me the travel bug. And since then, it took me probably about 5 years before I could get to a truly global company. I worked at a financial services company in Chicago as a stepping stone, but then got to American Express. And once I was at American Express, I knew there were opportunities to travel. I just needed to move through a couple of jobs there, but ended up at their international private bank and traveled extensively around the globe.
Okay, that's great. And you mentioned that it took you only 5 years to turn your company global. That's very impressive. So since you've encountered lots of international global situations, can you tell us some stories about when you've had some misunderstandings and miscommunications and some cross-cultural conflict. And how did you resolve that?
Sure. I should say I spent 20 years in financial services. Almost all of those organizations were global in nature. Then the past 20 years, it's exclusively working with global pharmaceutical companies of all different sizes. And I guess, the most interesting situation I run in repeatedly is with a client company in Switzerland that I've worked with for the past 15 years. And Switzerland, by its nature, tend to be very few people that are actually born and raised in Switzerland. Most come from France, from northern Italy, and from Germany. So it's sort of a melting pot of those groups there. And in that company, and I've worked at a number of other Swiss pharmaceutical companies, they all have the same challenge that you have to find a way to get the Swiss and the Germans and the French and the Italians all to work together like-minded individuals when they are very distinct in the way that they operate. And I found I had 3 different times where I had the exact same situation go on with very different drug launches, where inevitably it's the Swiss and the Germans are in the roles that have to be as precise as possible. So it's almost like the stereotype of that German or Swiss precision. And so they're often the ones that are manufacturing the drug, and they're the ones running the clinical trials. And then when you think of the French as laissez-faire and very creative and freewheeling, it pretty much holds up that way, certainly at this company. And so they tend to be the ones running the marketing side of things. So when you're in a launch, anything can happen. You're building up a large organization and spending a tremendous amount of money, millions of dollars, to build out your manufacturing, your distribution, your sales force, your training, your marketing campaigns, while you still don't know if the drug's approved. So very similar to what we're seeing here in warp speed with vaccines. That's what you do. So for me, I have to make sure that there's those Swiss and Germans who want to be as precise as possible, that I can work with them and make sure that we get the information we need from all the other parties that they require in order to build out the scale of the operation they need and meet their delivery schedules. But at the same time, the marketing people they're dependent on are very creative. They're constantly changing ideas, and it's very hard to pin them down until they absolutely have no time left. And so I have to work through that with them as a group. And I just found from the beginning, I just laid all the cards on the table. I poked fun at myself. I find self-deprecating humor is always a good way to get others to lighten up and open up. And we went around the room. We started talking about the nature of our work. We talked about sort of how we approach challenges, and the things that we found were successful with the team and things that frustrated us. And I find by getting them talking in that way, people start to see different perspectives on how people like to work and operate, how they make decisions, and how they like to work as a team. And then it's constantly just sort of helping to gravitate to people to a set of norms that will work well collectively as a group.
That's great. I love hearing people talk about their cross-cultural decision making and how they deal with, making sure that people actually can work together, even though people's styles are so different. They communicate and talk about everything so differently. That's great. So for our students listening, if they plan to just have a career in the United States, right? Do you want to stay in New Jersey or just New York, maybe? Do they really need global competency? Is there some advice you would give in terms of that?
I would say absolutely. I'd be hard pressed to find a company now that doesn't need an appreciation of the bigger picture globally. Because if you think about it, maybe your customers aren't global, but often your supplies are coming from global suppliers. You're working with a lot of different vendors coming in or out. If you're not, then you have to worry that you're not cost competitive. So you really need to be thinking in that way in terms of where your goods and services are coming from. And if your clients aren't global, then you're potentially missing out on a huge opportunity. And you can also be blinded by a global competitor that can come into the US market and leave you grappling to try and hold on to your market share. I know I do a lot of work with European and Asian pharmaceutical companies that are trying to get into the US market to launch a drug into a category where they're already leading drugs. And so for them, I'm giving them sort of the guidance on how to get into the marketplace. And I think in the pharmaceutical business, you're constantly looking from a global perspective. You're doing war gaming activities to see what would happen if these other players came ashore and if they started innovating around that product line. So that's just the thing to think about. The world's getting like to the point where everybody has to operate globally. And at the same time, you also have to look at it that fortunately, increasingly, diversity is winning out. So even if you're a US company with US clients, you're going to be working with colleagues that might have been born in other countries or first generation US citizens. And just the nature of the way that they were raised and the way that they think about things and reach decisions and go about solving problems is not necessarily the same as yours. And I think for me, I just learned from the guy in Long Island traveling around with rodeos with cowboys when I never thought they existed. It just gave me a whole different appreciation than when I interact with anybody coming from a different place from me, whether it's across the country or around the globe. Just not to jump to conclusions and not to be so set in my ways in terms of how I'm going about getting business done.
Okay, great. That's a really good point, right? Because every business goal is first to, of course, dominate the domestic market, but eventually they want to dominate the global market, right? So it makes total sense. My last question for you is, since the pandemic, a lot of things have changed. People communicate differently, and lots of businesses have changed their business model to fit how the world is changing. So what will be some of your advice in our broader topics that we talked about for our students going forward?
I would just say, I just found for my business, it's changed very little for me because I operate virtually with almost all of my clients. I would have once or twice a month, I'd meet in person with them, but teams work in a very virtual way just to get the business done. And I think, we've seen these different situations like 9/11 coming out of that, how, all travel was locked down and people weren't hopping on planes as they used to. And how eventually when the business travel came back, it never came to that same strength again because people found ways to work remotely. I think now it's an even bigger sea change. And I think people, the Zooms and WebEx and everything else are going to be a common fixture in all businesses. And you're going to be more hard pressed to make the business case for why you should travel. Not to say that it won't happen, but you need to know that in most cases, you need to figure out how to operate successfully in a seamless environment with people using all sorts of different technology platforms. So I think in some ways, the students, are getting indoctrinated at the right time in the skill sets and a way of working that is really going to serve them well as they go into workforces with the older generations that may not be as technology savvy. But what I would say is, the other thing that I've always found in organizations is you often have to influence without authority, which can be challenging as you're operating across departments within a company or operating across companies. It's even far harder when you're doing that in a virtual environment. So, to try to find ways to win people over and get them on your side and working in concert with you, because it's harder to see when they're making faces behind your back if you're operating virtually. So I think that's something that I think the students can learn a lot just from the way that you would normally work in a team environment with your colleagues. I just think about a lot of the skills that you have and the interpersonal dynamics, and just what you figure out now in terms of how to work with others and how to get people to work in a coordinated fashion with you is really something you just have to expand exponentially when you're working globally, and certainly when you're working in a virtual environment.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm sure we can talk all day with you just about your experiences, but we have two other fantastic panelists to get to. So thank you so much for all your insight. Chelsea, do you have additional questions for Jeff?
No, not at this time. Thanks.
Okay, great. All right. So moving on, we have Sam. And so he works in really interesting industry, right? So you do global luxury sales, which is fascinating. And the way you market and deal with consumers all around the world is completely different, especially given in recent years some of the bad decisions that some global luxury brands have done in terms of marketing incorrectly to certain cultures. So how did you get to where you are in your career over the years? And did you know that you were working on a global scale when you started?
Sure. Yeah. It's funny. I work in an incredibly global environment right now. Shangri-La has 100 hotels in 24 different countries and offices all over the world. So I knew that I was wanted to work in travel and see the world, but I don't think I ever thought about what would happen when I actually got there. And kind of from the first day in the travel industry, I've been exposed to such a wide variety of people. Even working at the front desk of a hotel, you meet folks from all over the world. So from day one, it's been incredibly diverse. And I worked at the front desk for about a year, and then got into the sales organization. And in hotel sales, we travel extensively. So both domestically to sort of now my role takes me all over the world. I've been very fortunate to kind of hit every continent with this job. And it's amazing how different all of our colleagues sort of work together, but we all sort of have sort of similar goals. So I think I've been amazed really getting a chance to sort of work with so many different people from all over the world.
Okay, that's great. So have you encountered in all your years working in this very global environment misunderstandings and people making bad decisions because they're not culturally aware of the differences?
Yeah, I sort of thought of two different things. I think one of them at first was maybe my own interpretation. I worked for an Asian hotel company, and I noticed every time I was getting an email, they were copying my boss. And I kept thinking, gosh, am I in trouble? And actually, it turned out really to be the way that our company communicated, that it was very sort of traditional to copy like your reporting line on emails. So that was something that really sort of took me some getting used to, because it was just a completely different way of how those were interpreted. But when you think about sort of a situation where, cross cultures, again, coming from an incredibly formal Asian company where everything is timely, it's written down. We were hosting an event in Brazil. So we were down in Sao Paulo, bringing 20 general managers from our hotels all across Asia to meet with our customers in Sao Paulo. So you want to talk about going from an incredibly organized culture to much more of a sort of laissez-faire situation. So when we're hosting events, we have tight guest lists. We have signed contracts. The money has been moved over months in advance. Well, that's really not how they work in Brazil. And eventually we sort of had to learn that we had to, my boss called it, let them Brazil it out. We let all the vendors kind of run around. We let all the chaos happen. We communicated to them what we needed, and they made it happen. And the event was exactly what we wanted. But convincing our colleagues back in Asia that it's going to be fine really was definitely an experience. And I think I definitely learned from it. Like, you're not going to change the way another country or culture operates. You have to sort of find a way to make it work. And when you're open to understanding it and operating in that environment, you can get stuff done. But when we sort of tried to get them on our timeline, it was just not going to work. And it was definitely a real eye-opening experience for me.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I remember when I was helping a client to expand his business in China, he insisted on hosting the first meeting in a conference room, but that's not how they do business there, right? You go to lunch, you go to dinner, you drink and eat with them. And this client refused to do that because that he thinks that's unprofessional, and the deal fell apart before it even started, right? So like you said, you can't force a culture to change in the way that you see the world, right? So I think that's a really important point. My next question is kind of related, right? So for our students, since we all agree that having this global competency is really important. So is there some way that they can work on this and train themselves to be better?
Yeah, I think so. I think what I've found, at least, is nobody expects you to be the expert in another culture. We have offices from India to Germany to Russia. Nobody expects me to know everything about them, but I think it's just having this like openness to their culture and a willingness to consider it. So I think people can do that by traveling, getting out in your personal time to go to a place that's completely different than what you've done. It just opens your mind to being able to work with another culture. And I think in the United States, a lot of the news here is always very domestic focused. And I think you have to really work hard to expose yourself to the news from other parts of the world. But I think just having a consciousness and an openness to consider and go into other places has really, really helped. And I think just being willing to ask people questions about, how is the best way I can work in your country? Or, I think people are just wanting you to be open. And as long as you have an open mind to that, I found that to really bridge a lot of the cultural gaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And living in the United States has a huge advantage, right? Because we get to know all kinds of people from all over the world already, right? So that's great. So we already have a advantage over everyone else. So another question is, since you have such an interesting global career for so long, what have you noticed that helped you to personally get to know other cultures and work with difficult clients that is very different?
Yeah, I think it's really just not forgetting the human side. And I think that I know that sounds so simple, but I'm amazed when I speak to a colleague that's in Bangalore and Chengdu or Kansas City. Everyone kind of wants the same things in life, and there's so much more in common than is different. And I found that when you take the time to get to know the person, all of a sudden, all the work stuff is so much easier. Everything else flows when you have that personal relationship, and it doesn't matter where somebody is from around the world. We all want respect. We all want someone to have interest in us. And so I've actually found treating everybody the same, regardless of their age, sex, where they're from, I think is the simplest, easiest thing that you can do. And I've found that every culture has been responsive to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. That's great advice. My final question for you is, of course, related to COVID-19. So your industry is definitely very much influenced by this pandemic. And of course, a lot of students want to go into hospitality industry, sales, and marketing. Right? So what will be your advice for our students going forward, knowing that the world has changed in this drastic way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we know that travel will come back. Everyone has that sort of itch to want to explore, and in markets where we are able to open, we've seen this roaring business come back. I mean, we're essentially back to normal in China in our business levels there. So we know that the industry will come back and people will always want to go through. What we have found, though, in this sort of lockdown time is it has made us work differently. And so I think as much as you can get up to speed with working in a virtual environment, some of that's not going to go away. So I think that will be important for somebody to kind of, start taking on right now. And I think one of the biggest things we've learned during all of this is just the importance of not forgetting the human connection during COVID. With our colleagues being sort of all over the world, we take phone calls as early as 5 a.m. and 11 p.m. at night. But when I turn on the video camera and see somebody in the face, look them in the eye, you get so much more done. You get so much more out of people, and it helps build that sort of team building spirit and stuff. So I think a lot of that's not going to go away. And so it's a good time to get used to working in a global environment. But we know travel will be back, and we'll certainly need a lot of people there to support it to get the industry going again.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So let's welcome our final panelist, Diana. And she has such a distinguished career. She's an author, she's an educator, she's also consults in legal and international business topics, right? So first of all, some more questions. I just want to know, when you started your career long time ago, did you know that you were going to expand your first business into a global company? Were you preparing for it, and what did you do to prepare for that?
I love your emphasis on a long time ago. Very good.
Distinguished long term.
Thank you. Yes, because I was actually at Montclair State, I'll say this, 50 years ago. My mom went there also, so we have a history at Montclair. My junior year at Montclair State, I was incredibly fortunate to be one of the students selected to go to the University of Copenhagen on the program that they had. I don't know if they still have it. And I really think that's what began so much of this. It was my first time on an airplane. I remember landing at Reykjavik, wondering if I had landed on the moon. We were there for 2 nights, and then we went on to Denmark. I was there for the 6 months in school, and then one of my friends from New Jersey came over and met me, and she and I used the Eurail pass, and we traveled all over Europe that summer. I mean, we went down to as far as Greece and through Italy, and I mean, really all over, and then came home on the QE2, Queen Elizabeth II, which had only been in service, I think, a couple of weeks. But my junior or sophomore year, I guess, at Montclair also, my parents opened a travel agency. So again, if we go back to, you know, I heard some of my colleagues here on the call talk about getting the travel bug and this idea of wanderlust and wanting to see places around the world and, you know, get to know people. I think my parents are partly responsible for that because my dad sent me on every trip that was offered so that I could learn about different cultures. I used to go around to the fraternities and sororities every spring break. We would put a trip together, and the first trip was busloads of students. We went down to Daytona Beach for spring break, but the next year they went to the Bahamas. Another time they went to Puerto Rico. So I really started very close to home. Then I went to New York City and I interviewed. I was kind of wanted to do something, branch out. I interviewed with Air France and Pan Am, thinking that might be a career for me, but I wound up working for Loews Hotels. And I love the hotel business, so I can really relate to Shangri-La Hotels. And then within that first year, I moved to California, got a little more wanderlust again, bought a one-way ticket to LA, had no job, nothing, whatever, but I wound up in the hotel business again, which again, like I say, it's just the most fun job, I think. And as it turned out, I was at the Ambassador Hotel, which some of you may remember on Wilshire Boulevard, across the street from the Brown Derby. And at the time, Peter Uberoth had taken over the management, and he also had an international travel company. And I think that was the first part of my career because I've had a series of them. But I used to do corporate incentives, and I would take, you know, let's say, for example, one of the accounts was Buick Motor Division, and we would take all of the top dealerships and we would take them somewhere around the world. So I would wind up with, you know, 300 or 400 people in and out of, you know, Hong Kong, or trying to think of, you know, Greek island cruises in Mexico and wherever it took us. Also, I have to say this, my daughter-in-law always says, don't forget, she says, you want a trip around the world on a game show, which is true. So that's another thing. I mean, I guess I've just always enjoyed travel. To me, it's the people. There's just nothing. To me, relationships are everything. And to meet people all around the world and to speak with them, I think sometimes, you know, a smile, even if you don't speak the language, you can communicate. So I took a little circuitous route. I went back to law school later in life. I have always taught. We have a class out here that I taught at Santa Ana College, which is called Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands. And in a class of 40, we would probably have 20 different countries represented. So we, of course, are extremely diverse here in Southern California. I think we are the most diverse state in the United States, which I think maybe makes us the most diverse state in the world, probably. So I hope I've answered your question, but I've started in the travel business and went to law later in life. Actually, when my son started at the University of Arizona, I decided to go to law school. So I have brought, I think, my business experience, my international experience to the legal profession, both in teaching at University of California, Irvine, where I teach international attorneys from all over the world, and MBA students who come from all over the world. So I'll leave it at that. And I hope I answered your question.
You answered my questions and much more, which is awesome.
Right. You can skip the other 3 questions now. I think we got through them all.
So I think I have a follow-up question, right? Since you have
Sure.
such an interesting background in law, and depends on what country you're dealing with, and the legal system's completely different, right? So are there any interesting examples you want to share with our students that business can face, the potential conflicts and issues in terms of that area?
Well, yes, I could. Let me talk about my University of California, Irvine students, for example, because they're attorneys. They come from all over the world. I've had Saudi Arabia, India, China, Japan, Turkey, Spain, whatever. I'm forgetting some of the countries. For their final exam, what I always gave them, because we wanted their perspective brought to the class, so these students, these attorneys basically would know, how do we deal with international business? Plus I do consulting here to small and medium-sized businesses, which I always encourage them to export, to expand their businesses. And what I always ask them to do is we would put together an agreement, a sales agreement, and they had to bring that agreement to class from the perspective of their country. With the differences from those countries. So that's how we learn from each other. I would caution any of my clients who want to go overseas. It's very easy, I would say. I mean, I had clients partners rather in Ireland. I had trademarked my logo when I had my company California Cookies in the European Union. These are the types of things that are fairly easy to do. My question to them always was, it's fairly easy to get into an agreement with someone, and there's not a problem until there's a problem, which may sound silly. But to me, it was always, if there becomes an issue, now what do we do? And that it almost had to work backwards. And I could give a very specific example of a client who came to me with an agreement to work with Amazon in China. And so of course she asked me to read the agreement for her, which I did. And I really had to tell her I couldn't recommend it. I said, I know you'll do what you want, but I can't recommend that you do this. Because once you had signed all of that, you had to agree that if there was any type of conflict, anything that needed to be resolved, it had to be resolved in Beijing. Everything would be in Chinese. And from a Southern California perspective, someone doing business here, you can't do that. To me, it's an impossibility, because even if you hire attorneys overseas, which obviously you would have to do, you still don't know what they're saying. And not that we don't want to trust anyone, but it's very difficult to do that, and becomes very expensive, and it basically becomes cost inefficient. So a lot of times I had to just say, I can't recommend this. I think you need to not do this, because there are other things that you can do to expand a business, and perhaps other countries that are friendlier from a legal perspective. And that's what you have to look at sometimes. What do you do if you get into trouble?
Mm-hmm. I love your example about China, because I deal a lot, like research-wise, and also business with China. So I would say it's one of the biggest market in the world. So of course, every company wants to expand there, but it's notoriously difficult to expand there because of the issues you brought up, and also the lack of transparency, and also the way that it's all about relationships. So what's written on the contract is not always the most important thing, right? So it's all about who you know, who you can bribe, and what kind of government official do you know, right? So it makes everything so much harder, right? So I totally understand where you're coming from. That's a great point. So next question is related to our students, right? So if, say, once again, if our students want to stay in the United States, right? They just love New Jersey, New York. Do you think it's important to develop their global awareness, and how can they do that?
Well, I have to say, I love New Jersey also. I'm a Jersey girl through and through, even though I now live in San Diego, California, which is wonderful, and I'm near my son and my grandchildren. But I really think anyone who thinks that they can just absolutely work domestically, I don't know, maybe you could work for the post office, but you're probably going to get some international mail. Maybe you could, I don't know, work at McDonald's, and hand out burgers, but even McDonald's is a hugely international company. As a matter of fact, I remember meeting representatives from McDonald's in the Regent Hotel in Hong Kong. And this is, 30-ish years ago. I think it was about 30 years ago. And they were getting ready to open up, China to McDonald's. So honestly, I don't think it's possible. I suppose you could try, but what do you gain by that? Really, I think you gain nothing, and you have severely limited any of your possibilities. I think you've eliminated a lot of fun. You've eliminated meeting a lot of great people. And I can't recommend it. I just can't. I don't think it's realistic.
Yeah, that's a good point. My last question for you is, of course, with the pandemic, what would be your advice for our students to, jumpstart their career in the very near future, where the world has changed so much?
Yeah, well, obviously the traveling, and like I said, I come from a background in the travel business, and it's been severely limited. I have lots of friends overseas. I have mostly in Europe, but I have friends in, Ireland, Denmark, France, a friend in South Africa who's actually Irish, and I speak to them. We do phone calls. We do email, of course. Sometimes, we do Zoom. It's nice to see someone, even if it is on a screen. But my suggestion would be, and what I found, let me talk about the travel industry just for a minute, because I'm still involved in that. I still consult in that. There are a lot of webinars, and there are ways that they can be educating themselves internationally through that. There are so many different sites where you can, sign on. I think they have to be very proactive in educating themselves to some point, but there's a lot of help out there. A lot of the hotels are offering webinars. I know all the cruise lines offer them. Airlines, there were 2 today that I missed. There was one yesterday, Windstar Cruises. There was one today for United Airlines. Ireland's done several. New Zealand did some. Australia. And I would say, prepare yourself. This is the time to prepare. It's like an Olympian. They've got 4 years or whatever to get ready. Well, they don't just sit around and start running, the last 2 months before they compete. You need to be prepared now. Be proactive. I would say speak with whomever you can, get on any type of webinars that you can, do reading, whatever, research. And when those jobs open up again, and when the different countries open up again, you'll be ready. And they'll want you.
That's great. Yeah, and this is the best time, right? We're all kind of
absolutely.
stuck.
Yep. There's no excuse, really. I know. The problem is, I think, so many of us have also been affected by this. I'm just going to say emotionally, it's kind of played havoc with our psyche. We've been isolated to a certain extent, and that's not good. But by the same token, that gives you the opportunity, if you're in place, to then do the research, do the reading, whatever. You really have to kind of force yourself if you're not feeling quite like it. You need to get at it.
Well, that's great advice. On that note, so I think thank you everyone for your individual segment. So I think Chelsea has collected some questions from our students, and I'll give the screen back to Chelsea.
Great. Thanks so much. This was a really interesting conversation. I love the different perspectives from various industries and the different experiences that led everyone to that realization of, oh, I need to learn to work with people from other places. And it's really to my advantage to do that, kind of starting there. And then I think all 3 kind of landing at this point at the end of your discussion about, it's kind of impossible not to do it. And I love seeing that and hearing about that progression. And I think, as almost all of the panelists mentioned, it is an inevitability in our world now that we need to know how to work with people, even if we don't work, physically go overseas. I do have a few questions, and I think maybe if I can just throw these out and each panelist can give their feedback on them. The first one is kind of related to that cultural competency and knowing, how do I learn this in the US, or is it really important to work overseas? So in your opinion, is that a necessity of spending some time abroad, either like Diana with studying abroad or with working abroad?
I just very briefly, I would say it just adds a dimension that I think you cannot get by simply, although it's great now because we have access to so many people and so many different things, but there is something about having your feet on the ground in another country and maneuvering and going in and out of grocery stores, and which is one of the things I always did. I would always go into a grocery store. I want to see what are they buying and how are things packaged, and it just gives you another perspective, I think, with, again, like I said, feet on the ground and being able to really intermingle and speak with people and have dinner with them and go to their homes and just visit with them. I think you cannot compare it to anything that we do virtually.
I would probably say, like, from our perspective, when we're hiring people, we want to know that they've traveled internationally to know that they can. It's a large investment when we're sending somebody on the road, and we're expecting people to do back-to-back trips. And I mean, I'm on the road every other week in a normal thing. We want to know, can you navigate the airport? Do you know how to drive a rental car? Are you going to be able to take our colleagues? So even if you haven't necessarily lived abroad, we're absolutely looking for people who have proven that they can travel abroad. And are open to that and understand that.
Good point.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say you don't necessarily have to live abroad, so to work in an expat status, but you really do need to get extensive travel, because there's just no replacement for that human connection. I think both Sam and Diana hit upon the human side of things, really connecting with people as individuals. I just found every time I went out on the road and traveled and met with people in their offices, I was literally winning the hearts and minds of those folks, because I'm collecting great ideas from them and they're getting my perspective. And you also command so much more respect from them that you made the effort to travel to wherever they're located, and you've taken the time to get their points of view. And I find having that connection, that personal connection from being in person with them, can carry you a long way with the virtual interactions you have. But I always insist with my clients that I have to have at least once or twice a year that I'm meeting with those individuals in person.
I think I've had a very similar experience to that in terms of working with global partnerships, and how I can work on a topic or just on one initiative. If we're only doing email or phone calls or even Zoom, there's really a limit to how far we can progress. And it's amazing to me that I would say that especially if you have never met in person before. And what's incredible is that once you do meet in person, even if it's at a conference that both people are going to, or at a so-called neutral location, that personal connection, and then you go back to your desk and things move at a pace that you would have never imagined previously. And I think that having that personal connection of meeting people is important, but then as you said, Jeff, having an appreciation for where they are and what it's like where they are, and just some exposure, even if it's not living in that place. Or earlier Sam had mentioned, no one expects us to know every single detail of every single culture. It's more about knowing or having the awareness that it will be different. Maybe you don't know how, but that it will be. And I think that really sets you up for a successful project or interaction. So thanks all for the feedback on that. I have a few other questions as well. The next one is, what would you say are the top 2 global competencies that are most vital in our new normal / remote work environment?
Remote.
I think the one that I would sort of jump to mind for me was, and if somebody was looking to take a class right now, what's going to help them in the future, it's get out there and learn digital marketing. We've had to learn to connect with customers in ways that are completely different. We're working on a TikTok video right now as a way of promoting our holiday stuff. I mean, my company would never have done this a year ago. And we're now looking to our interns, who knows how to do TikTok? So I think if you can take the time to learn about digital marketing, and that would be massive for you, because that's not going to go away. It's become so much more important. That was the big one that jumped out to me.
I would also say project management is key. I find because you're working across cultures, everybody goes, they divide up and they take their piece of the puzzle. And it's, especially challenging when you're working across different marketplaces and different cultures to have the master plan and have a way of keeping people aligned as there's constantly changes, shifts in timing and what's expected of them. That if you can develop a good skill set at project planning and project management now, that can really be a glue that can hold people together during stressful times.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. Of course, the only other thing that I would add always is back to, and I don't want to be repetitive, but the just contact, and sometimes it can be very brief, but I just have kind of prided myself on it over the years to just reach out and stay in touch with people the best that you can, however you can. I know everybody loves to text these days, but sometimes, just pick up the phone. I just do like to hear someone's voice every once in a while instead of my phone pinging me all the time. I do think it makes a difference, but I'm old school. We know that. So, but I just think it's like a handwritten thank you note. Can't beat it.
Yeah, absolutely. I find that I am, in times where I can't travel and visit partners and I can't, meet new potential partners, for me, I tend to almost fall back on those that I know really well and, that I have that easy communication with. And I think it is good to challenge ourselves to learn, how do we, market to new people? How do we connect with new people or even stay in touch? I think that it's challenging when we are in an environment where we have to schedule a Zoom call, for instance, to reach out and say, to try to give a reason for that contact or, kind of framing it in a business context. And I think sometimes that's very limiting in terms of not being able to see each other in person. So I do think it's really important that we make that effort. And I think it'll pay off once we're back on the planes again and abroad again. So another question is, what role does language play in the global marketplace? Although English may be considered the business language, can you give an example where language skills helped close the deal? Do any of you speak a language other than English? Just curious.
I used to be pretty good in French. I used to be really quite fluent, actually. And I did a lot of business in France. So I did find it helpful there. Everybody thinks that everybody around the world speaks English. It's not true. Yes, in business, mostly they do, but there's still something lost. And what I would always tell my students is, when you're having a conversation with your significant other, somebody in your family, a friend, whatever, do you ever have a misunderstanding? Oh, you do? Okay. And you're all speaking English, right? Or you think you're all speaking English, but did you all communicate that to each other? And did you really understand? Did you really say what you meant? And did they understand that you said this and that's what you meant? I said, now try to put that in a couple of different languages. I said, and just, try to figure out where's the misunderstanding. So I think, sometimes people will say, what if you had a superpower, what would it like to be? For me, I would love to speak, 30 or 40 different languages. To me, that would be so much fun. So I think it's important, aside from not being able to speak the language, because yes, English is clearly the international language and business language. I think it's just important sometimes to keep, like we say in the legal world, simple declarative sentences. Speak more slowly, speak clearly. Use simple words. Maybe you feel like your vocabulary should be different, but you'd be surprised how much further that goes if you just speak that way. I think it is much better. And of course, if you really need one, then I would say you need a trusted interpreter, because you still won't know what they're saying. So you really do have to trust someone else if it's something that is that important, like something legal.
I think for me, I growing up, I took Chinese lessons and I took French lessons, and I said, oh, I'll never actually need this, because in my life at the time, I didn't need it. And now I work for a Chinese company with a hotel in France. And so I'm constantly kicking myself. So I wish I knew it. And we are constantly calling on our colleagues who can speak a language. For example, if we have a delegation coming into our hotel in France, we need somebody there who can speak Chinese. They make our guests feel more comfortable. There's certain things that they just, it makes life easier. So it is really, really important. And it's something I absolutely wish I had. And I do sort of tell anybody, if you have the opportunity to learn another language, do it, because there are some things that it just makes getting the job done. And it is, when we're looking at resumes, if someone has another language on there, especially for my company, if you've got Mandarin, Cantonese on there, it absolutely raises a resume to the top of the pile for us.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to piggyback on that point. So I think in cultures where trust is so important and interpersonal relationship is trumps everything else, language is very important. So, Sam's example with Chinese clients is completely true, right? I have plenty of people in China who wants to expand here. They speak English, but they don't trust, the language enough to want to deal with people who only speak English. So they have to sometimes go through me so that I can find someone they trust, right? Because they just simply can't get that over, their normal beliefs. So I would say that in some cultures, it's very, of course, a big plus if you speak their language. But in some other cultures, it's not as much of a big deal.
I also have experience that I think it's worthwhile to just learn a few things, even if you're not going to, you're not going to master the language, but if you can learn a few basic phrases. It's interesting how in my experience, the standard of Americans knowing a second language is very low in terms of what the rest of the world thinks, because they're thinking, we're all learning English, they're not learning anything. And I think if you can just, have a few little phrases under your sleeve, it's amazing the response that you get from others, like, oh, wow, that's great, and maybe you didn't say it perfectly and it's something you can laugh about, but I think even if you're not going to make the effort to learn, another language in fluency, I think if you're headed somewhere, you're working with someone from a particular place, it always pays off to basically have the respect that you've made an effort. I think it's always a nice surprise. I have a couple more questions. We've got a few more minutes here. Let's see. Which country has been the most culturally challenging in your career and why?
Oh boy. I early on in my career, I was this company that I started working with, Peter Uberoth in California. We had charters that ran to, at the time, the USSR. So I'm going back to the early 70s. And from New York, we took a full charter plane into Moscow. And I found at the time, it was still KGB, whatever, I found that they were, I could use the word hostile, but that doesn't quite describe it. But it was very, very difficult to deal with the local Russian guides. I had 169 people with me, which in and of itself was quite a few to manage in what I considered a hostile environment. Pretty fascinating place to be, but they were not particularly cooperative. They pretty much all did speak English. And of course I didn't speak any Russian, but it was very difficult because they were so unfriendly. Sometimes you can go into a place where, you might have difficulties and problems, whatever, but someone isn't working against you. And I always had the feeling there that they were working against us. In either whatever it was in passport inspections. One of our women from Connecticut came, she had an expired passport. That was a whole issue with them. It's just very uncooperative, very hostile, I think is the best word I can come up with. They just weren't nice, Sometimes you should just be nice and you could get so much done. That's all.
I think for me, part of my role is I represent our company to travel agents. So the fun part of the job is getting to take people from the US to another country. And I do find taking people to China can be the most challenging just because it does tend to feel for people from the States the most culturally different. And I think, whether it's ideas of personal space, ideas of food, I think that has been, it just culturally feels the most different. So that's probably the most challenging. But similar, I'd actually say I struggle with Russia a little bit as well too. I think we're very expressive, myself especially, here in the States. And I think culturally they communicate in a very different ways. It might not mean anything, but it's very easy to misinterpret. So I think those are the two that I found to be most challenging.
I'd say for myself, I found the Italians the most fun and also the most challenging to be productive with. They, I found in so many cases, we would set up with a plan, we'd establish deadlines and all, but when they're done working, they're done working. They, I often question what's wrong with us, because their end of day is the end of day, and their weekends they respect, their vacations are solemn. Whereas, we're just going nuts. And, because of the nature of what I'm doing, trying to move these product launches out as quickly as possible, you sort of have to hold people at their word. If they say they're going to meet a deadline, they'll meet a deadline. And not to say they're not working hard, but if we make slippage and we have to burn the midnight oil, they don't have midnight oil. What they do have, though, is great meals and great fun when you're with them. So I found especially there, if I had an Italian manufacturing team, which was often the case, I had to get there. I had to win their hearts and minds over, and then we could negotiate and figure out what were the right kinds of bribes for them to get them on my side. But it was always an interesting experience.
But Jeff, we're so much fun, right? And we talk with our hands. You didn't have to learn the language, right?
Yeah, of course. Yes, very expressive.
Yes.
Oh, thank you all. I think we're pretty close on time. I do think that, one really important, seems like kind of a theme that we're talking about in almost every response that we have, is that that as a culturally aware person, we're constantly in flex. We're constantly thinking, okay, what's the best way to work with this person or communicate with this person? And how can I be the one who is the flexible person to move things forward? And really being that, almost taking responsibility for that intercultural connection. And I think, for our students, this is really helpful as they learn, how to work with others within the US while they're in teams in their classrooms, or whether they are, working with someone in a workplace from another culture. I think, of course, it seems that all the panelists are also really advocate taking the opportunity to expose yourself to other cultures almost as a practice to really gain some of these skills. It's something that's difficult to learn from a book or from watching. I think it is something that you have to actively participate in, and there are a lot of opportunities for that here, right, within the US to expose yourself to other cultures. So we're really lucky in that regard, as Juju said. But I do want to, I wish that we could continue on. I think there are a lot of follow-up questions that are kind of at the tip of my tongue, but I'll hold them for now. And just want to take a moment to sincerely thank all of the panelists. We really appreciate your time, really appreciate you sharing your expertise and your experience, and perhaps most importantly, your advice to students who are really conscious of the fact that this is an important topic that they need to focus on. And as well as Juju, thank you very much for great moderation and leading the conversation this evening. I do want to point out to everyone, this is a series that we do on a monthly basis. So our next conversation will be in mid-November, and it's going to be on the topic of entrepreneurship abroad. So we'll be speaking with folks who have started a business in the US and expanded out to other countries, or who have started a business abroad and then expanded into the United States. So it should be a really interesting conversation. You can find out about all the details on our Instagram page. We're at Feliciano Global is our Instagram tag. And otherwise, thank you again for everyone's participation. Thanks to all who have attended, and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.